What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Landlord Chick podcast. So, here it is. It's part two of the Creating Your Own Lease Deep Dive. Some of you had recently, like in the past week or so, sent me a message on Instagram like, hey, only seen the first part of this. Where's the second part? It was always scheduled to be about 3 weeks later. I'm not someone who does stuff back to back, and I know maybe that night might not be the greatest for a podcast because you might have to literally look and find part two or find part one again now. But I'm always someone who feels like, okay, if this wasn't something that pertained to you, I don't want to have you tune out of my podcast completely for 2 weeks in a row. So this is how I choose to handle, let's say, sequential episodes per se. But let's get into it.
Building a real estate portfolio is as much about buying properties as being a de facto entrepreneur. I'm Karina Ufinger. I'm a multi-property investor, rental management company CEO, and also a landlord coach. I'm going to show you the systems and knowledge you need to thrive as a real estate entrepreneur. From your first property purchase to building a portfolio of passive income where you work less than 5 hours a week, you'll learn the essential information and skills to build a profitable portfolio and live the life you truly want. Whether you are well on your journey or just starting out, you're in the right place. Welcome to the Landlord Chick podcast.
All right, so in the last episode to this series, we talked about the difference between a lease and a rental agreement. When we're talking about the lease, we're talking about the entire lease, including its addendums, versus the rental agreement is just like the top sheet or the first document. Then we got into specifically the rental agreement and what you want to be sure to cover in yours, whether you're going to make it up yourself, have an attorney draft it. We talked about some good sections to have in there. Then we got into rules and regulations, which is your form or your document for all of your own particular individual property rules. Depending on how big of a landlord you are, you might consider having multiple rules and regulations. I say this because if you have, let's say your portfolio is like 6 or 7 duplexes, and then you happen to have a 20 unit. That 20 unit is likely going to have a fair amount of its own rules or concerns that you need to cover that really don't apply at all to the duplexes. So you may find yourself creating other rules and regulations documents if you happen to have a diverse portfolio like that. There's nothing wrong with that. I think it makes it really easy for tenants. One of the biggest issues you could create for yourself is having your rules and regulations, which is too bulked up with regulations that don't apply to a tenant. Because if they're told, oh, this one doesn't apply to you, and then go 2 more down, oh, this one doesn't apply to you, and then go 3 more down, and this one doesn't apply to you, it becomes confusing to them, and at some point they just begin to tune out the entire document itself. So if you're going to have a situation where you have a specific property that has a lot of its own rules and regulations, please create 2 different ones. It will be a lot less hassle for you than having a tenant who disregards or gets confused by the rental provisions or the rules and regulations that you have. So I highly encourage you to create 2 different ones if you happen to have a really diverse portfolio like that. Now, that being said, this is what we covered in the last one. Now let's talk about other ones that we need. So one I want to talk about is here in Wisconsin, we have a non-standard rental provisions. Now, even if you don't have property in Wisconsin, I encourage you to listen to this section. I have grown to truly appreciate this document more and more throughout the years. At first, I thought it was a hassle because here in Wisconsin, we have to have the tenant's initial each clause, and it's really annoying to kind of set up an e-signature and stuff. So when I first started out, I wasn't really a fan of the document. It was mostly because of the fact that we have to initial every single line. But Now I've grown to appreciate what it means to the tenants, and when I tell them what it is, it really helps drive home how the security deposit process works, but more particularly, exactly what can be charged out of their security deposit when they move out. The purpose of the non-standard rental provisions, the majority of the purpose, is for the tenant to clearly know the fines and fees that they could be charged throughout their tenancy and how they can be taken out of their security deposit. So even if you don't rent property out in Wisconsin, I would highly encourage you to, of course, consult your state statutes, see if you have something similar. And if you don't have anything similar at all, I strongly encourage you to create your own version of this document, minus initialing every line or every clause, because that is, like I said, my biggest pet peeve with this document. But I would highly encourage you to create a document where you are listing the fees and the fines and everything that can be taken out of their security deposit when it comes time for that process. I have found it extremely helpful to be able to just reference back to a specific clause in the non-standards when someone might contest their security deposit. Now, I used to use a boilerplate one, and what I mean by that is one that was created by a company here in Wisconsin, which is attorney drafted, but I found it very basic and it didn't necessarily cover specifically what I felt I wanted to in it. And it also didn't allow me to add any extra additional fines or fees. So I ended up drafting my own. So in my own, I cover all of the fines that could be taken out of their security deposit. So this is the late fees. This is the you didn't pick up your dog poop fee. This is going to include the non-registered pet fee, because if they have a pet and they didn't tell me about it, then there's an initial fine, then there's a fine per day. So I have all those fines listed that could be taken out of their security deposit. The other part that I'm covering is parts about altering the unit. So how if they change the paint color, then the cost to change everything back to the whatever color I had used. I have that covered in there as something that'd be taken out of their security deposit. I have covered in there some miscellaneous fees. I have a very large miscellaneous fee section. So for instance, I have a fine that can be incurred if someone schedules a work order but then fails to show up for it, or we fail to gain access. Another fine that I have is if somebody requests a paper copy of a document that they've been already issued. So we issued them their lease, and let's say 6 months later, they come back and say, oh my gosh, I need a copy of my lease to register my kid for school. There's a fine for that. Before, when we used to send out paper lease signatures, there was a fine, and the fine's still in there, even though I don't do this. If they sent it back to us and they tried to alter a line, or they missed, unfortunately for them, they missed initialing one of the many lines on the non-standard rental provisions, there was a fine for that. So I do have a fairly decent list of fines that can be incurred that are sort of out of the ordinary. And I guess you could say this comes from years of experience, but it maybe also comes from a certain aspect of negativeness, maybe, about being in the industry for this long, that I see a lot of stuff that tenants try to pull consistently. And at some point, I just got sick of it and attached a fine to it. So another good example of this one would be I have a fine that I can incur to a tenant if they call the emergency line for a reason that is not an emergency. There's a fine associated for that. Now, there's a fine associated for that for a specific reason. In case you're kind of wondering, well, why? Well, I do it because I use an emergency line service, which means that every time somebody calls in, I get minutes deducted from the minutes that I buy. So if somebody's continually calling in for, let's say, a broken doorknob, and then they're calling to tell them that their light fixture in the living room broke, this is costing me money. So that's why there is that fine in there. Now, I don't automatically charge a lot of these on the first offense. Like it'll be sort of like a, hey, just so you know, if you continue with this, this actually is something that's covered in the non-standard regulations, that there's a fine attached to this offense. So just an FYI. But there have been times that I have charged these things. Particularly the lease one. The lease one, sending out a lease renewal and having it come back altered, or they purposely chose not to initial some lines on the non-standard. Yeah, I have charged out that fine. And that's just because, you know what, at some point, I've got to do what I've got to do to make sure people know that I'm serious about my rules and all my other fines. So I encourage you to create a non-standard rental provisions that's going to describe the fines and the fees that can be taken out of their security deposit when they move out. The other thing here in Wisconsin that we cover in the non-standard is there's a clause that they initial that gives us access to their rental unit when they request a work order. It's just a really good thing to have somewhere in your lease. So if you're not going to incorporate a sheet similar to this would be something I would put in your rules and regulations. For us, I think it has to be in this form, so that's why you don't find it in the rules and regulations and what I'm describing, because in Wisconsin, it has to be on this form. But if you aren't in Wisconsin, have a clause on your rules and regulations that provide you the right to enter a unit when a work order is requested. The other thing that I would encourage you to have, and this is also covered in the non-standard, but I would have it covered in my rules and regulations if I didn't have a non-standard, but I would cover a clause that allows you to gain, that basically doesn't allow you to, but it informs the tenant of what emergency entry is to a unit and why it might occur. And of course, why it might occur is going to vary based on the type of unit. For instance, if you have a single family home, you're obviously not going to be putting in there that you may enter the unit if there is a water leak in another unit that might affect it. Obviously, that doesn't really apply, but that gives you an idea of how you kind of describe what an emergency situation would be where you would enter a unit without giving the required notice per the state laws. So that's something else I encourage you to have in there. Another thing that's a good thing to have in your lease, it's probably covered in any sort of pre-made lease that you buy, pre-made rental agreement. But if you by chance draft your own or have an attorney draft it, just be sure that you have a clause in there about mitigation costs. So mitigation cost is basically reducing the cost to you if a tenant breaks their lease. Like it's basically saying that you can charge them for rent that you planned on getting because they didn't give proper notice. It also kind of outlines that the expenses for re-renting the unit if a tenant breaks their lease could be charged to the previous tenant. I feel like maybe the majority of that was more referring to the old days when we would place newspaper ads and stuff like that. I kind of struggle nowadays to think of what costs beyond like turnover you would incur to re-rent a unit. Like, you know, turnover costs are your repairs and your maintenance and stuff. That obviously could be charged to the tenant if it applies for like excessive wear and tear. But other costs, I feel like those don't really happen anymore, but I still keep that little wording in there just in case. You know, why take it out? It's just one sentence. So that's what we have on a non-standard rental provisions. Again, if you don't have it in your state, I highly encourage you to create a separate document which outlines the fees and the fines and everything that could be taken out of the security deposit when they move out. Now, next, we're going to talk about smoke and carbon monoxide forms. I hate saying that word. It's so hard for me to roll it off my tongue. This is a form that you're likely going to have some sort of required form in your state. I would be shocked if there is one state in the continental United States that does not require a smoke and carbon monoxide detector form. See, I can't say that word. It never rolls off the tongue very well at all. But this is a form that you likely have. I don't care what state you're in. 99% of the time, you're probably going to have one of these forms. So it's a form that states require that basically goes over who's responsible for what with the smoke detector. So it basically says that the tenants are responsible for the batteries, the owner is responsible for testing it. In some states, the owner is responsible for testing it. In other states, the tenant is responsible for testing it. So this is something you would consult your state statutes if you have to create or purchase, just to be sure you know who's responsible lies where with that. But no matter what your state is, the responsibility for replacing or fixing a malfunctioning detector is going to be on the owner. It's going to be on the landlord. And then it's going to give some sort of deadline as far as when smoke detector issues need to be resolved per state statutes. So here in Wisconsin, our state statutes say that a landlord has 7 days from finding out of a malfunctioning or broken smoke detector or carbon monoxide detector. They have 7 days to fix it. So they have 7 days to get it working. Your state statutes are probably going to have some sort of deadline from the time of notice to when it needs to be completed. So it might be 7 days, it might be 4 days, it might be 3 days. It's going to vary by state, but there's likely going to be a deadline. And those items are all covered in most smoke and carbon monoxide detector agreements. So this is something that you definitely want to have in your lease, just because chances are it's definitely going to be part of your state statutes. Now, these forms are ones that are signed by both you and the tenant. We have on ours that we encourage the tenants to test them on a certain day. Like they pick, like maybe it's the first day of each season, or they pick, family birthdays or whatever to test the smoke detectors because they are required to test them. So that's something that we put in ours. The other thing that we have on ours, because this is required by the state of Wisconsin, we have to actually inform the tenant where smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors have to be installed. So smoke detectors, one on each floor, if it's a multi-level home. And then there's also a requirement that you have one like within X number of feet of bedrooms, and that sort of situation. Then with carbon monoxide detectors, in case you don't know what that is, which I feel like most people know what that is something that helps you basically detect a gas leak. So here in Wisconsin, they have to be installed within 15 feet of a gas burning amenity. So whether it be a water heater or it be a stove or a gas dryer, it has to be within 15 feet of that. So here in Wisconsin, it could be kind of crummy because if you have on one end of the house, you have a carbon monoxide detector because you have a stove on the kitchen, and then the other end of the house, and let's say it's a very long ranch, you've got a gas dryer, you're likely going to have 2 carbon monoxide detectors. And then of course, if you have a gas water heater in the basement, you're going to need another carbon monoxide detector in the basement. But that is going to drastically vary by state, so please don't take that as the rule of law. I would definitely consult what your individual state laws are, because I know, for instance, and I know we talk about these a lot, but I know California and New York are more strict in these regulations than Wisconsin is, so definitely consult your state statutes to figure out the distance for carbon monoxide detectors and what the rule is on smoke detectors. Now, another form that I have in my lease packet is one that I made up myself. And this is a form which basically describes all the cleaning charges that could occur and how they can avoid incurring them. So it's basically a how to do a move out properly form. That's basically what it comes down to. And a lot of people look at me strange when I say that I have this in the lease packet. They're like, oh, you're encouraging them to move right away. This is what people say to me who are like, well, why do you have to have that many documents in your lease? Like that's who I feel is actually telling me this. It's the same people that think that my leases have way too many pages in them or way too many clauses in them. But that's just, I've been around the block quite a few times. But anyway, so in this form, I'm actually giving them specifics of room by room, what we expect them to clean, how to clean it, and then what the cost is if it is not cleaned. So for the bathroom section, it says in the bathroom, please be sure to clean your tub, your toilet, all of your fixtures. To clean all of your fixtures means that they are free of hair, they are free of hard water stains, they are free of soap scum. We're giving them specific products that we encourage them to use to ensure they get the proper results. And then each line item has a number attached to it as far as what the charge will be at move out if it's not cleaned. So we're going to have like toilet, and then in parentheses next to it, it's going to say $15. And then tub, parentheses next to it, $40. And that basically gives them an idea of what the worst case scenario charge is if they do not properly clean that particular fixture. And it also gives them an idea of, wow, okay, if I wouldn't clean my unit at all, it's going to be, if they add it all up, they would find out it's going to be like $480. And that's a totally legit cost, by the way. This isn't anything that I created just like trying to put fear into them, because here's the thing. These fines have to be reasonable. They have to be fines that won't be thrown out by a judge in a court case. So, of course, all of these charges are completely reasonable. There's nothing that is going to encourage a judge to toss it out. So these aren't just random numbers I thought of. These are actual ones that I created based on the average time it takes to clean that particular item in relation to the labor cost. Now, I will admit I probably should update these numbers pretty soon, because I created this about 6 years ago, and obviously since COVID and everything, prices have gone up for pretty much everything. So I should adjust these fairly soon. But I think it's a good idea to give tenants an indication when they move in what it might cost them if they don't properly clean it or even maintain it through the course of their tenancy. And at the end of this, at the bottom page, I'm also giving them a little bit of a free tip about how to properly move out of a unit. So I make sure and tell them that all parking permits and keys have to be placed on the countertop, and that trash on the curb or trash left on the front porch does result in an additional fine. So I'm very clear and specific on things I want to be sure are handled smoothly for the move out. And then also at the bottom, I'm just saying that it is their option whether they are present or not for a move out inspection. When it comes time to move out, if they don't specify that they would like to be present for a move out, we will assume that they do not want to be present for the inspection or do not feel need to, and we will conduct it without them. So that is probably one of the newer forms that I have added to my lease. I probably did it in the last 6 years. And I've actually seen some pretty decent results with it, especially when I point it out to tenants when they give me notice. So when someone gives me notice, and this is maybe something we'll go over in a different podcast, I have a preset checklist of everything that I do before the tenant even moves out. But one thing I do like to do is I like to draw their attention and be like, hey, just a reminder, in your lease, there was this form which showed the fines and fees that could be incurred if you do not properly clean your unit for move out. So I do like to draw their attention to it when they give me notice, and I have seen very good results since implementing not only this form, but then actually drawing their attention to it when they submit notice for move out. Now, another form that you might have to have in your lease, depending on the age of the property, is going to be a lead-based paint form. This is something I feel a lot of self-managing landlords and honestly even property management companies mess up on. And I don't know why this is, because it's honestly almost the easiest form to get a hold of, because the federal government provides you these forms for free if you go to the right website. So I believe it's going to be Housing and Urban Development, so HUD.gov. If you go there, you're going to be able to download a PDF of the, I think it's Lead Safe for Homes is the pamphlet. And then you're going to be able to download a lead-based paint addendum for rental agreement. So this is something you get completely for free. And for some reason, despite the fact it's completely free, it's easy to get through the government, I think I have seen more leases come through that don't have a lead-based paint addendum that should, than vice versa. So I think 9 out of 12 leases that come to me from other property management companies or from being self-managed on properties that are older than 1970s, specifically 1973, they don't have the lead-based paint form in them. So really briefly, we've talked about lead-based paint in a prior episode, like maybe over a year ago now. So if you want information on lead-based paint, scroll through some of the previous episodes. You'll find one that was a deep dive into lead-based paint remediation and what exactly lead-based paint is. But it's safe to say that if you have a property that is older than 1973, you likely have lead-based paint in it. Because of that, you need to provide first the Lead Safe for Families pamphlet to every tenant that moves in. Now, this used to be a real pain in the butt before our culture became digital, because you would have to order these pamphlets specifically from HUD, and you'd have to keep them in your apartment somewhere, or in your office somewhere, and give them to every single tenant. And, before they actually started like printing them as well, you had to basically, and then at some point you had to download the form or the pamphlet because they weren't issuing them anymore. And then you had to print it off yourself, and it was like 30 pages. So kind of a pain in the butt. But now they have a digital copy of it. And so basically what happens is we email a digital copy to the tenants. We do it independently of the e-sign for their lease, just because otherwise there'd be like an additional 30 pages in there, which they're really, truly not going to read. They're just going to skim through, and it's going to probably, I've had it crash some of the leases that I try to do through e-sign just because the lease ends up being way too big. So for that reason, we send it in a separate email. But then the addendum, which basically is the acknowledgement that they received that form or that pamphlet, and then it's basically our declaration to them about any known lead-based paint, that is actually going to go in the lease. So the lead-based paint addendum, in this capacity, what it's doing is it's having the tenant acknowledge the fact that they received that pamphlet. Then it's the landlord declaring any knowledge they have of lead-based paint. So there's going to be a couple different options on that form, and you're going to check the one that's applicable. Almost exclusively, the only one that I have seen used is going to be the one that says that the landlord has no knowledge of lead-based paint. And that's because honestly, the majority, and I say like majority 99.9% of the people I have dealt with, they don't necessarily have concrete evidence that there is lead-based paint. I did manage for someone about 2 years ago a property where they just happened to get a lead-based paint report as part of their closing documents. It was about like a 4-year-old report. So because they received that report and it confirmed the presence of lead-based paint, that particular owner for that particular property had a separate box that they had to check off versus the one that the majority of my clients check off. So if you do happen to get something like that, you will have to declare it, that you do have knowledge of lead-based paint, and you will fill that out a little bit differently than probably the vast majority of people fill that out. Now, here's a little tip to the property managers out there. I have been taught that you should not be signing these lead-based paint addendum forms. So what we do is our landlords sign them once they purchase a property, and then we use that one for X number of years until basically we get an updated one from the landlord because they bought another property. So unless, of course, you're going to have a situation that I talked about where maybe they know about it in one particular property, you're going to have one lead-based paint form that includes everything. And this includes, if you're a self-managing landlord, honestly, what I would do is if I had one property where I had received a report at closing, I would check off the appropriate box, and then I would have a separate lead-based paint addendum for every other property that I own. So I would have two, just that I would include in my leases based on whether or not they were that property. So that really kind of covers what I have in my leases that I think would be applicable to you guys. The other two forms I didn't get into are forms that I specifically have to have in Wisconsin as a property manager. I'm not going to get into those because this is the landlord podcast, but then also they are ultra exclusive to Wisconsin. I don't think they serve any sort of other purpose, so we're not going to go over those. But that's a deep dive into creating your own lease, some of the addendums and the clauses that you want to have covered, and specifically where to get some good resources for things. I hope you guys enjoyed this deep dive. I like doing these every once in a while, just like a little deep dive into a particular topic. We'll probably do another one in the future. I'm kind of got something brewing in my head that I think is going to be pretty good, so we'll see if it actually comes to fruition. But on that note, I hope you guys have a great week, and I will see you next week for another episode of the Landlord Chick Podcast.